About 4,000 years ago, before humans, polygons inhabited the Earth. And different polygons lived in different parts. Like you had your triangles in Northern Asia, you had your pentagons in South America. But on this one small island off the coast of Southern Europe lived a large group of quadrilaterals. And they were all different types of quadrilaterals. But there was this one guy named Mr. Quadrilateral who was married to Mrs. Quadrilateral. And they had thought that it was time to have a child. And they got pregnant very quickly. And when this child was born, they were in awe because this was the most beautiful quadrilateral they had ever seen. And they decided to name him Mr. Parallelogram. And he was just gorgeous. He had both pairs of opposite sides congruent. He had both pairs of opposite sides parallel. He had both pairs of opposite angles congruent. And he had his diagonals bisect each other. Mr. and Mrs. Quadrilateral were so happy because they felt like they had a perfect baby. And Mr. Parallelogram led a very nice life. He was smart, he was good looking, everybody knew him. And so things were going well, and he had a great childhood. And then he grew up, and one day he's walking down the street, and he happens to bump into another quadrilateral that looks just like him. Turns out her name is Miss Parallelogram, and she was from the southern part of the island, so he didn't even know that she existed. And they were talking, and they decided to go out on a few dates, and of course they fell in love, and they wound up getting married. And a few years later, they decided to have some children. And they were blessed when they found out that they were going to have twins. And as soon as the twins were born, they knew what to name them. They had a son named the rectangle, and they had a daughter named the rhombus. So like their parents, they had their traits. The rectangle, he had his opposite sides congruent and his opposite sides parallel. But he didn't only have his opposite angles congruent, he had all of his angles congruent, and they were all right angles. And his diagonals were congruent to each other and bisected each other like his parents. His twin sister, the rhombus, now she had opposite angles congruent like her parents. And she had opposite sides parallel, but she had all four sides congruent. And her diagonals not only bisected each other, but they were perpendicular as well. And so the R&R twins had a great childhood. They went to good schools, they went to good colleges, and they were very bright. But unlike in the world of humans, where we don't think brothers and sisters should fall in love, in the world of polygons, it was a great thing. And Mr. and Mrs. Parallelogram were so happy about this because we kept the properties within the family that they were thrilled when Mr. Rectangle and Miss Rhombus decided that they were in love and they wanted to get married. And so they did, and they had a child. And this child was the most beautiful of all quadrilaterals. And when she was born, Mr. Rectangle and Miss Rhombus and the grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Parallelogram, could not believe how perfect this quadrilateral was. And when she was born, they named her the Square. And she had all the traits of her father, the Rectangle, all the traits of her mother, the Rhombus, and all the traits of her grandparents, the Parallelogram. So she had all right angles. She has opposite sides parallel, all four sides congruent, and her diagonals were congruent and bisected each other and were perpendicular. So she was definitely the best. And she was very smart as well, went on to a good university, and she decided to study her heritage. She wanted to know where her family came from. And so one day she went back to Mr. Parallelogram, her grandfather, and said, you know, Grandpa, I really want to learn more about my great-grandparents and our extended family. So they did some research, and it turns out that Mr. Quadrilateral, Mr. Parallelogram's dad, had an affair at one point, and this affair produced a child. So Mr. Parallelogram was really surprised, but they felt like they should go meet this other quadrilateral, Mr. Parallelogram's half-brother. So they jumped in the car and they drove to one end of the island, and they knocked on the door, and when they opened the door, they met Mr. Trapezoid. Now, Mr. Trapezoid had some similarities to his brother. He had only one pair of opposite sides parallel, but that was about it. And Mr. Parallelogram was really glad to meet him. And while they're sitting there at the table chatting and getting to know each other a little bit, the doorbell rang. And in walked Mr. Trapezoid's daughter, the isosceles trapezoid. And the isosceles trapezoid, she, like her dad, had only one pair of opposite sides parallel, but her non-parallel sides were congruent. She also had congruent diagonals, and she had upper base angles congruent and lower base angles congruent. So she was quite pretty. And Miss Isosceles Trapezoid and Miss Square really hit it off. They chatted for a while, and everything was great. And then at one point, Miss Isosceles Trapezoid said to Miss Square, "You know, my dad isn't your grandpa's only half brother. Well, there's another sibling that lives on the other end of the island. We don't see her very much, but Mr. Quadrilateral is her dad as well." Well, Miss Square was shocked, and so she went over to tell her grandpa, Mr. Parallelogram, who was in turn also shocked, but they felt, well, we're all here now, let's go and meet her. So they all jump in the car, and they drive to the other end of the island, and they meet Miss Kite. And she's a lovely, lovely lady. And she does not look like her brothers, but she does have some common traits. She's got all four sides, and some of her angles is 360 like Mr. Quadrilateral, but she has two pairs of consecutive sides congruent, and her diagonals, one is the perpendicular bisector of the other, and then her angles, she's got one diagonal that bisects a pair of angles. So she was a little bit different, but they were so glad to meet her. And after talking to her for a while, they realized, she might not look like her brothers, but she and Miss Isosceles Trapezoid have some common traits of their cousins, the rectangle and the rhombus. So it was a lovely, lovely day, and they were all very excited to meet each other and learn about the people in their family. So the moral of this story is, if you want to remember the properties of the quadrilaterals, always remember that every child has the traits of their parents and some traits of their own. And sometimes traits run through the families and skip over generations, and you might have common traits with your cousins. The end.